over the course of 100 years, they spawned in different directions because of local floods and fires and disasters. Insurance companies started asking for different things, and it kind of like roots of a tree into different directions. And over the past 5-6 years, the federal government played an important role in aligning the provinces on a national set of building codes. There can still be derogations from that national set, but at least we're all working from the same common platform. And that's really a key piece of the federal government's role that I do fear is getting missed in the current conversation, where the primary emphasis is on them removing the barriers growing in their backyard. No, it's also about their active involvement as the central government in a federation.
Welcome back to Tank Talks. I'm your host, Matt Cohen, and we've got an incredible episode lined up for you today as we're diving into the topic that sounds dry on the surface, but has massive implication for Canada's economy, entrepreneurs, and our innovation economy. We're talking interprovincial trade barriers. And joining us in the tank is Ryan Manucha, research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and Harvard-trained lawyer, and winner of the 2022 Donner Prize for his eye-opening book entitled Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups. In this episode, we talk about why Canada sometimes feels like 13 separate countries when it comes to doing business, how dumb rules on booze, trucks, and credentials are quietly costing us billions, and why provinces are still dragging their feet when even solutions like mutual recognition are on the table, and which province leaders will blink first at the fight back against the unfairness in these trade barriers. Whether you're a startup founder trying to scale across provinces, or just annoyed that you still can't order wine from BC to Ontario, this conversation's for you. Now let's jump into the tank with Ryan Manucha. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Ryan.
Thanks so much, Matt. It's an honor to be here.
You know, obviously we know each other as you've been a partner and friend of Ripple for quite some time here. But for some of our listeners who don't know much about you, maybe we can kick things off with a bit about your background, you know, how your journey at Harvard trained you as a lawyer, and also want to hear about your craft beer enthusiasm a bit, but really want to hear about how you became so passionate about interprovincial trade.
Yeah, I was researching international trade when I was at law school. And around that time, BC and Alberta went at it on an internal trade war. BC refused to allow more bitumen out to the coast. And in response, Alberta said, okay, well, we won't sell your wine. And for a guy who had been looking at international trade wars, I was like, what is happening internally? How can this be existing within Canada? And I went down this rabbit hole and I found the amazing story of Gerard Comeau, who back in 2012 crosses from rural New Brunswick into Quebec, trunk full of beer, comes back over the border, and he gets detained and fined. And he points to Section 121 of the Constitution saying, hey, this is the free trade clause. What do you mean I can't do this? Unspooling the story of how we got here to where Gerard Comeau just trying to do his shopping on the other side of a provincial border. And it took me all the way back to pre-Confederation to really understand the story and be able to think of how we can move forward.
You know, Ryan, the time in which you studied a lot of this interprovincial trade, and now where we sit today in the summer of 2025, it feels like you've been preparing for this conversation for a decade or so, because interprovincial trade, correct me if I'm wrong, was not something a lot of people in the day-to-day nomenclature would talk about. It was always something in the background, right?
Internal trade always fell to the bottom of the heap. And you can imagine it. A politician who stands up and says, hey, let's focus on this 40 million person economy instead of the 340 million behemoth south of the border. Most voters would say, is their head screwed on correctly? Like, it's not the priority, because you sound a little crazy, but you know, Donald Trump has been the best thing for interprovincial trade. That being said, like, the history of internal trade tells us this is how it happens.
Right.
This constitutional free trade clause. What happened the year before that got stuck in there? You know, to simplify it a little bit, U.S. canceled an early Canada-U.S. free trade agreement in 1866. You know, and that's not the only reason, but we've been here before, and it takes an external catalyst to get our house in order.
And that's what I've always been saying on the podcast and elsewhere. Like, for as much as you can hate Donald Trump, at least he's bringing topics to the very top of the conversation ladder that we probably have shoved down too far and need to have these conversations about. But just to give our listeners a bit more context, you are a bit of an expert on this. You wrote a book called Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups that won the 2022 Donner Prize for the best Canadian public policy book. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
One, were you surprised that you won? Also, you know, why did this become such an interesting book to win at the time?
I was honored, completely honored. And I'm so glad that the Donner Prize has given me this platform and the spotlight on the file. But you're right. Like, for an issue that's been around pre-Confederation through Confederation to the present, why now? It's been so serendipitous that we've had this opportunity to really rethink our internal economy. You know, we rewind the clock on the country, right? And we go pre-Confederation. We didn't have a railroad, right? And talk about a transaction cost that was eliminated through the hard work of many, many folks. And now we're in this new realm of like, how do we create that sort of integrated economy? It's not so much the sexy topic of railroads, it's the less sexy regulatory disharmony, but it's still important.
Give our listeners who are maybe not familiar with Canada some background as well. We've got 13 individual provinces rather than this one unified market. I just came from the West Coast. I was in Vancouver, BC. I was in Calgary. I was in Edmonton, Alberta. Obviously being based in Toronto, Ontario, we see a lot of different things and hear a lot of things, but the views are pretty bifurcated. It's 50-50 on where people view how Canada is not unified. In your view, how serious is the fragmentation in this economy and in this population base? And what does it mean for like Canada's competitiveness with Mark Carney now, leading the charge? And how does it affect business leaders, you think, trying to scale?
I was out in Northern Alberta end of last week talking to municipal leaders about interprovincial trade barriers. And they, I think, share my sentiment, which is sort of, we've seen legislation tabled at the federal level, seen it tabled at the provincial level, but we got to see how it pans out. Like there's a great deal of discretion and wiggle room that's still sort of in these pieces of legislation that we, we'll trust it when we'll believe it when we see it. And I think that's the right posture to take for a file that has sort of dogged us for decades, centuries. What's been estimated on the benefits of internal trade, about $200 billion a year, 7.9% boost to the GDP. And I know your good friend, John, sort of has taken issue with this. And I know that Jim Basile has also taken issue with it. We can debate the numbers. We can debate the methodologies. I think a couple of things. First off, I think that the definition of an internal trade barrier needs to be broadened. Most people sort of have a narrow understanding of it. Let me give you an example. One that just, has come to my table pretty interestingly recently. National excise tax stamp for cannabis products. And you're more in the digital physical space. Goods and supply chains get rejigged all the time. Customers cancel orders. The way that your supply chain reworks itself, you might have to reroute an order that was intended for Manitoba to Alberta. Well, what these small and medium-sized producers have to do is they have to go in, scrape the stamp off, piece it back together, glue it back together, show it to a CRA auditor, and then burn it immediately afterwards. It's that sort of inefficiency. And in my mind, that's an internal trade barrier. It's a transaction cost on account of an internal frontier. And I think when people start to get reductionists, you can say, well, what does that matter in the grand scheme of things? The alcohol, direct to consumer for alcohol. If I can get my favorite Okanagan wine to my doorstep, I think two things. One is in the aggregate, they really cost a lot. And I think in the information and digital space that you and Jim and John operate in, I highly respect it. The information spillovers, the bringing of best practices when people can more easily move from one province to another, the knowledge spillovers, if we rewind the clock back to 1871 and I asked a room full of economists, hey, what's the economic output of a CPR? I don't think any one of them could have credibly projected out a 2 trillion G7 nation. It's the same sort of thinking. And a final thing on this is like, we do what we can to articulate the topic. My book is called Booze, Cigarettes, and Constitutional Dust-Ups. We try to put numbers on the problem to drive a business case that doesn't require going down to Mar-a-Lago or building $1 billion data center or sort of inculcating new, it's stuff that's sort of, within our grasp. But more to the point, it paints a picture of what's important and what we can achieve. And I think that it doesn't capture even the dynamic effects. The 200 billion, I think, is an even lower bound. We can have a debate on what that number should be. We can debate about the elasticity assumptions.
Let's just give some of our listeners examples of exactly where the interprovincial trade barriers impact people's day-to-day lives. So from what I've researched, let's just give some examples. Okay. So let's say BC, you have somebody who's a business in British Columbia. Their GST is at 5%. They deliver goods to a customer in Ontario, which HST is at 13%. The business must charge the 13% HST because the place of supply is Ontario. But if the customer picks up the goods in British Columbia, the business charges 5% GST plus any applicable provincial taxes, let's say the 7% PST. There's different trade barriers that happen between those two provinces. There obviously are a bunch of zero-rated goods out there. We're talking milk, bread, vegetables, basic groceries, hygiene products, prescription drugs, agricultural products. But it gets pretty complicated, especially when dealing with the language laws in Quebec. So what other examples can you give our listeners to maybe who don't see the impact to their day-to-day lives that is affecting the supply chain and the way goods are moving across provinces? Wine obviously being one of the bigger topic ones.
I was just in Sexsmith, Alberta, talking to a municipal leader who encountered an entrepreneur in their community who was trying to create ready-made meal packages. And they were trying to build their business and grow onto the other side and be able to sell into Fort St. John's up in northern New British Columbia. The problem is that the meat that they were getting that they had sort of arranged for them to be using was from a provincially licensed abattoir, not a federally licensed. You could argue it's an oligopoly. You could even argue it's a duopoly of who controls the federally licensed abattoirs. When I sat down at a cafe in Grand Prairie, I didn't ask where my roast beef was coming from. So when it comes to trucking, we're talking about the varying driver qualifications for long combination vehicles, the varying size lengths for semi-trucks. When we're talking about the variability in electrical codes or the size of downpipes as between Manitoba and Ontario, it's the stuff it's in the goods. But I think another key part is services and people. Someone is asked to do an extra test to bring their engineering qualifications from New Brunswick over to Nova Scotia. That is a internal trade barrier. It's a transaction cost on account of an internal frontier. And some folks may debate whether or not it's required or legitimate. But I think there's a spectrum, right? A gradient. One is the one we've seen in Quebec where they've it created legislation ostensibly to create for the free-flowing movement of people, but they've carved out construction. And so you say, well, okay, that's what happened here. The most extreme example is like you can't even take a test to try to redeem your qualifications. You got to start from zero, all the way to like, oh, you got to be supervised for a period of 4 or 5 months. It's a gradient. And, I'm not here to tell you, Matt, what Canada should be. If you're like, hey, I want my real estate agents in Ontario to be the most stringently assessed and reviewed, and I don't want any questions about them, then you can say, yes, we're putting up the barriers and making it really hard for someone to move and port those qualifications. We want them to start from scratch when they get to Ontario from Manitoba. If that's your version, I don't think that should be the Canada we want, but.
Yeah. And I know you're not a US trade barrier expert, but do you know exactly how things work in the US from a state by state mandate and how we compare to them in terms of the provincial versus state trade barriers that we have up that they don't? And how it's a disadvantage to us.
The US is a very interesting example because you've got 48 continental states. It is so much more competitive down there that you can't erect these. You see some driven by the big states like California, but It is so much easier for a business to get up and move and to command sort of like a liberalization of trade flows. And then two is their constitutional law is a lot stronger than ours when it comes to the erection of interstate trade barriers. I think a good example is Australia. Similar heritage to ours from like a legal and constitutional background.
Commonwealth background, yep.
Yeah, they went through the same set of reforms 30 years ago that we're going through now. Hopefully we're going through now, which was like, hey, if it was licensed or certified in another Australia, if that security guard passed their test in Queensland, they're good enough for New South Wales. And if they're not, New South Wales can argue that the Queensland security guards are not good enough, but they've got to write out why, articulate reasons, and then explain what the compensatory measure is to bridge. And that's over time, mutual recognition is where we're going to. And it's a culture where regulators are talking with one another. And Matt, maybe you have examples of folks in your space that you know of where this concept has been applied. But it's when the regulators, we're on the bridge of it, like in clean tech, the variability in solar tech installers and wind turbine technicians, those credentials, emergent occupations. And we're already seeing the early innings of variability there.
That's absolutely. You talk about the constitutional missteps maybe that our country made. Let's give some context though, right? So historically, the goal of the Confederation was to create a common market within Canada. Section 121, which you referenced before in the New Brunswick case, the 1867 Constitution basically said that goods from any province shall be admitted free into others. So how did we end up with so many of these internal trade barriers, despite the early vision of free trading among the provinces?
The beauty of the Canadian Constitution is one that allows the world's second largest landmass to remain intact for a long time, over 150 years. We need an element of local control, right? The ability for governments to regulate in light of local considerations, because otherwise this whole thing won't work. The problem becomes when the assignment of power to the provinces allows them to create regulatory fiefdoms. I'll take construction codes as an example. Over the course of 100 years, they spawned in different directions because of local floods and fires and disasters. Insurance companies started asking for different things, and it kind of like roots of a tree into different directions. And over the past 5-6 years, the federal government played an important role in aligning the provinces on a national set of building construction codes. There can still be derogations from that national set, but at least we're all working from the same common platform. And that's really key piece of the federal government's role that I do fear is getting missed in the current conversation, where the primary emphasis is on them removing the barriers growing in their backyard. No, it's also about their active involvement as the central government in a federation.
So if it's so good for Australia, who did it 30 years ago, why is there no action being taken up? If freeing up these interprovincial trade is a no-brainer for growth in this country, no matter the number of GDP growth you think will happen, 3%, 4%, 7%, why is it taking us so long? And what are the main obstacles keeping these barriers in place? Is it lack of political will, provincial self-interest, pressure from protected industries like we see in Quebec, or is it something else?
It's a lot of what you just said rolled into one. I'll give you a great quote from a former CP Rail CEO who goes, "There's this creeping insidious movement to longer and heavier trucks. And every time truck sizes increase, it becomes harder for us," meaning the railways, "to compete." So in many instances, there is when you raise the maximum build height, allowable build height with timber as opposed to cement and steel, that's one industry against the other. And you see those debates play out in the Hansard debates in the Senate. So there is that this or us scenario. There is sometimes like construction codes, it starts spawning and turf wars arise where, provincial regulators, federal regulators don't want to give up their areas of control. There's also I'll be, in a positive way, there's the fear, right? If I'm advising a minister and I'm saying we should be accepting of the way Manitoba licenses social workers and doctors, the natural pushback is like, hey, well, what will happen? What's the potential impact of this? And this is why I keep reassuring people that mutual recognition is a process of learning how Manitoba licenses its social workers. But yes, at the outset, in principle, you're saying, okay, I'm about to change the way of doing business. This is different. I got to adjust. And so I think there's a reversion to the status quo. But I think it's also the biggest thing, which is like, and Jason Kenney, former premier of Alberta, he really put mutual recognition on the map. He was a longtime leader on this and really popular, when it wasn't less prevalent. He himself said, when you've got 1,000 things, you've got political fires, how are you spending your time and your political capital? Unfortunately, interprovincial trade does tend to slip down that list.
Bill Gurley calls this regulatory capture. And we definitely have examples of regulatory capture in the interprovincial trade barriers. And the other thing too is that industry often have more expertise and data than the regulators or the policymakers have, allowing them to kind of shape these technical standards and regulations in ways that appear neutral, but they effectively block out of province competitors. For example, the different provincial standards for product packaging or safety certifications, as you mentioned. It creates this unnecessary compliance cost for businesses to operate across provinces, right? Who do you think is going to make this change happen? Is it going to be the industries? Like tail wagging the dog here. Who is going to lead? Because if policymakers don't have all the data and the lobbyists and the industry leaders and organizations are doing what they need to do best for their constituents, how is this going to change?
What's really been so great to see is like the coalescing of two big entities. The first ministers have been gathering together on a fairly frequent basis, more frequent than we've ever seen, as well as the Committee on Internal Trade. Right. And so it's the direct attention of first ministers and to some extent their cabinet appointees. That's really, really crucial because as you said it, there are stakeholders who don't like, it's like, yeah, I'm okay with safe injection sites, just not next to my house. Right. It's the same idea. I'm all for internal free trade, but don't touch my industry. It's the same thing. So you have to have like Tim Houston out in Nova Scotia, Doug Ford in Ontario. It's really impressive, this leadership leading from the front and sort of being willing to break through and definitely sort of, I'm sure they're getting phone calls saying, hey, whoa. So it's going to come down to creating legislation, set of rules that, ensures that when regulatory authorities are maintain roadblocks going forward, that there's justification. Why? Oh, is there a health concern? What's the health concern? Can we do it any differently? I've been really impressed to see regulators say, okay, we don't need this. We don't need that anymore. It's kind of like the doging. I hate to use the word doging, but like the Elon Musk principle of like questioning all the requirements. Why is that there? Who said it needed to be there?
But Ryan, let's just play devil's advocate. If we try that approach of trying to uncover the reasons why we do things, we'll never get anything done. The Doge approach was actually first stop the payments, right? Stop the fraud, and then see who screams loudest to know who's committing the fraud. And in my belief is like, first invest, then investigate, right? You have to just invest in making the change and then see who really is impacted and then adjust afterwards. If you take the approach of creating new policy after taking all consultations into consideration, you're really just going to be back to where you started, won't you?
And sort of the early innings of this mutual recognition, this free trade legislation spawning up inside of provincial capitals. Part of my concern is that it's not all looking the same. So mutual recognition has a different sense in one province versus the other. If I'm a market actor, if I'm a business, and mutual recognition has it's 20 days here and 30 days there, and equivalent means this here. And as an examiner, researcher of this topic, I'm a little afraid, right? I would like to see a little bit of consolidation on meanings.
You're an analyst first before you're an investor. I get it.
on the flip side, we have this internal trade court, right? Many people don't know about it.
What is it?
So it was invented in 1995 and it continued through to today. We haven't had a decision out of it since 2017, but it's where a business or a person or another government can take a government to court for violating, we're the only country that has this pretty much, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement. We said, hey, internal trade is so bad internally, this was back in the early 90s, we're going to create a free trade agreement for within ourselves to go beyond what the Constitution asks us to do. And we're even going to introduce an internal free trade court. And we've seen cases come through it. So I love the idea of allowing market participants to discipline our governments, because as you said there's no one knows the issues in their industries and the craziness of certain regulations better than participants. And if you have a forum where you can launch a lawsuit, that's excellent. So I've advocated for a number of reforms to make it easier for small and medium-sized businesses to access this court.
But you said the Como case, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Como beer case that was a few years ago was a high-profile Supreme Court case, right? About the New Brunswick man that fined for bringing beer. Why didn't that go through the interprovincial system courts?
That's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that question. But
so they've been sitting on their hands since 2017, not doing any cases. But I guess, let's play it into today's language. You got Danielle Smith, who feels like she's leading the charge on this, okay? And you've got Doug Ford, who's trying to strike deals as fast as he can, because let's face it, they are the two biggest provinces when it comes to the GDP. And then you've got Quebec, who is sort of this stepchild that sits there and sort of has the final say a lot of the times when things happen. But what happens if you have, let's say, four of the biggest provinces team up together who represent 70% of the GDP, and they strike their own deals? What happens to the rest of the group?
So I'm all for, hey, and we even already saw this, Western Canada, they're miles ahead on this. They created the Pan-Canadian Free Trade Agreement. There's a Western New West Partnership Trade Agreement with BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, because they're like, we want to go even farther than this.
Yeah, tell us about that. What's in there?
I am all for experimentation. BC and Alberta, they were like, hey, we don't have direct-to-consumer. That's okay. We'll do direct-to-consumer for alcohol. We're not going to wait for everyone. You had Nova Scotia come out and say, hey, we will open up and recognize goods, services, and people on anywhere else. If you open, so it's mutual. They could have gone solo. They didn't have to wait for anyone. So it's like this conditionality. But hey, if a subset wants to, and the data, the economic literature from abroad, projections by the incredible economist Trevor Toome within Canada shows that even if provinces go it alone, they stand to benefit. Or if they go, a coalition of the willing, they stand to benefit.
The biggest example is the securities regulators. The fact that the OSC has 12 other regulators that they have to coincide with is crazy.
That's other example. It's that is I don't know if people think of that as an internal trade barrier, but the lack of a national...
The cost?
Yeah, and I'm sure, I can only imagine you know them well.
It's crazy, the cost associated with having to register across different ones or get approvals for an M&A transaction, the legal fees that come up around it. It's pretty crazy. So what do you think happens with where we stand? Where does Danielle Smith end up laying down the law and taking where she wants to go with the province? Because right now, separation is like a 50-50 in that province.
We're seeing the early innings of certain provinces going farther, right? And they're going to reap the economic benefits of that, the prosperity benefits of that. And great, and it'll show the rest. In the words of Doug Ford from earlier this week, I guess the train's kind of leaving the station here. You're welcome to jump on. And, in 5-10 years, you'll see it in the data. And I agree with, John and Jim that perhaps, you're going to see greater gains from the idea of pivoting to a knowledge-based and information-based economy, right? I don't deny that. My area is internal trade, and that's what I'm going to focus on. All I'm emphasizing is that, hey, we have a lot of work to do here. We're not going to get to zero, right? July 2nd, we're probably going to see a whole host of policies that you and I might be okay with because they protect an interest that we actually care about more than increasing prosperity by that delta. We're going to say, hey, this is the time to reimagine.
I think John and Jim are talking about the 5-10 year plan, where you're talking about the instant sort of benefits, trucking and supply chains.
In pre-Confederation president, we have never had a window for internal trade like we have had right now.
Right.
This is unparalleled. We have Trump. And if we can't do something, I don't know, this is a once in a generation, once in a confederation sort of moment. And that's why it's okay, July 1st, we got the deadline in the sand. We'll push as hard as we can. There's going to be a lot of work to come afterwards. But this is the point at which we're rallying. And so hey, it's like a sprint here.
Oh, I mean, listen, trucking is often cited as a prime example of internal trade barriers. And I saw a report that you co-authored that found inconsistent provincial trucking regulations that add roughly 8% to the cost of goods shipped in Canada, about $1.6 billion a year. Can you maybe unpack some of that and sort of how truck weights and sizes translates into real inefficiencies or costs for businesses moving goods? Because those are immediate impacts we can see in the back half of this year.
Yeah. Having to change wire tires at borders, that sort of thing. Again, I mentioned some earlier ones, but varying driver qualifications for long combination vehicles, the mutual recognition of farm vehicle license plates. There is physical, geographic, topographical reasons for variation, right? There are tunnels that have to get through the Rockies out west, right? And so that means certain things for
Winter tires in Quebec versus Ontario.
Right. And so, but in some of those cases, it's an infrastructure problem where maybe there's a side payment involved, right? Like we see that all the time. The federal government gets involved and pay almost, they'll pay a good chunk. Right now, they're extending or improving the Trans-Canada Highway out in Newfoundland. The federal government's stepping in with a good chunk of that. And if that's what it gets to, with these regulatory authorities, I on the record, so I'm not saying anything that's private, but Nova Scotia's Professional Engineering Association says, hey, 26% of our revenues is from out of province engineers paying us their annual dues. I'm like, okay, that sucks. I'm sorry your business model is sort of set up that way. But is there some bridging mechanism where we can say, okay, this mutual recognition concept needs to drive through a lot of change. And I understand this is going to create perhaps some transition difficulties. We got to get to the other side of this. Perhaps there are creative solutions that exist to get people on the same side and get alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. We have the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, CFTA, that was put in place in 2017 to help reduce internal barriers. Yet there's still many hurdles that are remaining. And I've read that more than 1/3 of the 334-page CFTA is actually filled with provinces' exceptions to the rules. Is that even making a difference? Is it full of loopholes and opt-outs? Like, should we just scrap that whole thing and rebuild that?
Truthfully, on the exceptions, the reason you put an exception is because you're afraid of getting taken to internal trade court. As I told you,
no one has since 2017.
It's like a risk-adjusted decision for a government to say, hey, we're going to reduce exceptions, right? You're gambling on someone bringing a case against you a little bit. One of the exceptions the federal government reduced in the last wave was ending the exception for the monopoly of letter delivery by Canada Post. And I said to myself, who is raising their hand to do that, right? So you have to look into some of these exceptions. Let's say that it's a good signal of policy, it's movement in the right direction. Maybe something gets unlocked by doing so. Hey, great. But again, this mutual recognition is the place to be focusing on. I'm overall hopeful, Matt. I'm really hopeful. I don't want to have a falsely declared mission accomplished. And I think we're kind of teetering at that zone. And I'm going to do my best. And I hope the policy community hopes to do their best to keep folks honest. And the needle is moving.
Okay, let's get your sense on where the federal government plays, because you got the province leaders obviously doing their own negotiating side tables. You've got the federal government, obviously, with Mark Carney leading a lot of these conversations. What role should the federal government play in all this? Like, the Constitution doesn't explicitly guarantee interprovincial free trade, and provinces have a lot of power over local commerce, obviously. Do you think we need Ottawa to step in more forcefully, perhaps using its powers under the trade and commerce clauses of the CFTA? Or is it something that really should be driven by the provinces themselves?
I mean, before we get to the first one, I think what can happen is, like we saw in construction codes, the individual tasked with certain responsibilities in the government of like PEI or Newfoundland or some of the smaller provinces, like there's a resource bandwidth capacity issue, right? And so the federal government can be a resource enhancer. They can be leaned on. They also are uniquely positioned. Let's say every province, like the cost to them is $1. The federal government sees like in the aggregate it's $13 across the provinces and territories. They're uniquely positioned to say, okay, I see the aggregate cost here. It's worthwhile for us to spend up to theoretically $12.99 versus an individual province will only spend up to 99 cents to sort of resolve the trade barrier, right? And so, yes, I'm not opposed to the idea, there's the game theory element of like side payments and like what perverse incentives does it create. But again, if you need some transition, a lot of these come down to like sources of revenue. Like, why do we have recurring trailer fees in certain provinces at 3-year cadences? And some provinces say it's unlimited. You don't need to come back and renew the payment for the trailer licenses because this is an important revenue. So the Comeau case, it was about a tax revenue funding schools and hospitals in New Brunswick. That's what they don't want people going off into Quebec to buy their booze. Like they get, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars through the HST and just profits. Then they say, okay, well, how am I supposed to pay my teachers? I get that, right? But again, this is where the federal government is uniquely positioned to not only help capacity build on electrical codes and sorts of things like that, trucking regulations, but they can also sort of see a little bit better what the aggregate cost is to Canada.
Yeah, it's interesting. The federal government has that bird's eye view to see all of this. But as you know, we have an investment in a company called Page that is actually doing this at the lower levels, where they're actually aggregating all the context around all the different conversations in government, all the laws that have been passed or all the ones that have been rejected, and actually mapping out all the interconnectivity between these different decisions so that people come with a much better contextual awareness of what's happening in government. Because I wouldn't have known that the reason why New Brunswick was fighting so hard was because it was paying for the schools in their district. But probably if you pull back a couple layers of the onion, you'll find that stuff. I mean, you've seen so many absurd barriers, Ryan. Like, give us an example of one that you just shake your head at every time you see it or hear about it.
Right now, I think it's the variation, the definition of high visibility safety apparel. The one that people point to that has now been solved. What constitutes a first aid kit? Those are the ones that are sticking people's minds.
It seems like we're building some momentum and urgency and awareness around this. You've been speaking and writing about this topic across the country. I've seen you on CBC radio multiple times discussing this. Like, how are people reacting when you go across the country? Do you find business leaders and policymakers are receptive to your message? Or is it still hard to get the message across to Canadians to care about this stuff?
The StatsCan released the first ever survey on interprovincial trade. And what was impressive was to see what people pegged as internal trade costs, right? And I think transportation being foremost, there's an element of distance. One thing that I've really been trying to emphasize, and I've been overjoyed to see it, is people seeing things that they didn't think of as an internal trade barrier. But then, now we're like, oh, wait a second, because I think there's a certain level of like, oh, this is just the cost of business. This is just how things are. And, it is what it is. But now it's like, wait a second, this is an internal trade barrier. And there's a mechanism and a pathway for me to flag this, for me to put this on the table in front of regulators for reconciliation amongst provinces. And I won't pretend it won't be easy, but also elevate the national discourse and say like, hey, this is worthwhile. Again, we can squabble. Is it 200 billion? Is it 150 billion? The point is, it's a lot, right? And also, it doesn't capture the dynamic effects of us emphasizing competition within there was a conference earlier this week, and you had the CIBC CEO go up and talk about, hey, stability for banking is important. This is why we have a very protected, financial services sector. And then you had Michael Katchen from Wealthsimple who goes up and says, yes, can we take stability too far? And it is a tension, stability versus innovation and entrepreneurship and being able to build. But you want to create an ecosystem and space for people to say, hey, I can build in Canada. The environment there is competitive and I'm going to be supported. And internal trade is a reflection of that mandate.
You kind of say like whether it's 150 or 250 billion, like, right, those are real numbers. The expenditures for 2024-25 are like a 200 billion in budgetary expenses for operating capital and transfer payments. Revenues are 500 billion. The deficit's going to be around 40 billion. Like, these could have meaningful impacts to our government's operating budget. We shouldn't gloss over it.
No one cares about internal trade barriers. They care about how it affects their lives. If it inflates the cost to build, or it makes it harder for workers to get where the jobs are, the downstream impact on housing, or with the trucking inflating the cost of goods by 8.3% on average, meaning that folks going to the grocery store see that reflected in the price of the goods on their shelves, and the cost of living being sort of very top of mind right now. I think that's also, something worthwhile.
The biggest one I always think of is probably healthcare, and the way that people can leave a province to go to another province to get private healthcare, but they can't do it within their own province, right? Because of the Canadian Healthcare Act. We just saw recently online, some guy in Canada went with his wife to China and they got an MRI for $200 and it was printed off like a vending machine receipt. We're talking about inefficiencies that affect us all. But as you say, if it doesn't show up on like a receipt, you don't think of it as an interprovincial trade barrier. But if it affects the supply chain behind the scenes with regulatory and licensing and all that, it is a barrier that is definitely costing us in the bottom line in our pocketbook. So I appreciate all the work you're doing in kind of demystifying a lot of this. Where do you think we go from here, Ryan? Obviously, you're trying your best to get the message out. You're working as a research fellow with the C.D. Howe Institute. Like, what's your outlook? Are you optimistic?
I am. I try not to let great be the enemy of good. I'm really happy with the legislation that's been tabled. Again, it's far better than where we were 6 months ago. And once things are on the book, we can work with them and sort of improve the regime. The Canadian project is never going to be perfected, right? And that's what we're improving it. If you see us, you've seen the tables where we're falling off the OECD tables on prosperity and growth. Like, hey, internal trade is one leg on the stool. We're not the whole narrative. But this is an important leg. And so that's what we're trying to drive towards. We care about the outcomes, the prosperity, the ability to buy and be a stable, enduring country is what we really care about.
Yeah, and it's great to have, tech leaders like Michael Katchen speaking up about this. But what other sort of message would you like to leave some of our listeners who come from like the entrepreneur, startup, and tech ecosystem about how they can get involved and make their voices heard about why it is important for everyone to be paying attention to these interprovincial trade barriers and, what's at stake for Canada's economy? Everyone wants to build Canada better for the future. How do they get involved, I guess, in this fight and conversation?
Just raise your voice. If you see something, surface it, right? Like these internal trade barriers, they are hidden. Once you discern them, hopefully, if you've listened to this, you're saying, okay, that, message me, post about it, bring attention to it. Because the only people who know about some of these barriers and the costs that they impose are folks on the front lines with their businesses. Don't expect, these all-knowing government or regulators to be aware of it and they're working on it in the background. Quite frankly, they need your help to know and where to go.
Yeah, and I've been told many times that people in government and politics are listening to this podcast and getting a lot of this conversation to the forefront. So if you do see something, message Ryan about it on LinkedIn or something. He's always active and fighting for a really good cause here. Before we wrap things up, Ryan, we always ask our guests for their fast favorites. So first off, your favorite podcast.
Tank Talks, but Short Histories of by the Northern Network.
Nice. And what's that one about usually?
It's about Marie Antoinette. It's a little nugget of 15 minutes of a topic you thought you knew something about, and you always come away learning something.
It's like a TLDR on like the biggest things in World War history, but on a very specific topic. I love that. Yeah. Next is your favorite newsletter or blog.
This group of ex-National Bank folks came out with the Bullpen Finance newsletter. And it's a great rundown economy, with a primary focus on the Canadian economy.
Oh, cool. It's called the Bullpen?
Yeah.
I got to check that out. Next is your favorite tech gadget.
It's my new Whoop, courtesy of my brother, Lucas.
Oh, you got the 5?
I'm not sure which one.
Oh, whatever. Nice. What do you love most about the data you get on it?
It's being able to see improving trends. Yeah.
Have you tried the AI coach inside of the app? It's fantastic.
I should give that a go.
Try it a go. Ask it to create you some like kind of variabilities and ways to improve your trends. Speaking of trends, what is your favorite new trend?
I was going to say tied to the Whoop, and it's not new, but like sleep, healthy sleep.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much over the past 6 months since getting this, I've been like, wow, my brain is firing a lot faster. The synapses are all, but it's because I've been mindful of how many hours I'm getting.
That's great. I finally got the 8 sleep after everybody on this podcast had recommended it as their number one thing that saved their marriage. So I got the 8 sleep. It's the mattress that cools down to a temperature for your liking between you and your partner. The podcast actually forced me to get for me. So that's great. How about your favorite book?
A Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl.
Of course, a favorite. And last but not least, your favorite life lesson?
Distill the essence. I think that was...
Who said that one? Do you know?
My father. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us in the tank today with Ryan Manucha, research fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute.
Thank you so much.